Good morning. What we're going to do is we're going to go over your viral disease sheet that I handed out to you before we left. And I'm only going to be able to talk for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to have to stop, and then we'll start with another 10 minutes. The file can't be any longer than that, or it won't upload. So at the end of 10 minutes, I'm going to put a timer on, and then I'm going to stop, and you may have to watch a couple of videos in one day because we're going to try to get through these the best we can. One of the things about viruses, oh, and by the way, if you hear dogs barking, I am sorry. There's a lot of commotion, people outside right now, and I apologize. I'm trying to lock them up, but you may hear them from time to time. Okay, preliminary things about viruses you need to know before we actually start is that, first of all, you can get these viruses the same way that you can get your bacterial infections. So you can inhale them. If you inhale them, you're going to show symptoms that are upper respiratory. If you eat or drink them, then you're going to have intestinal problems. You can be bitten. We'll go over rabies and some of the ones that occur from a bite, zoonotic diseases, and they're going to have varying symptoms. And then, of course, lastly, we have personal contact. Now, one thing I want to explain to you about viruses before we start these, because it'll help you a little bit, is that there's really two kinds of viruses. Some of them have DNA as their genetic material, and some of them have RNA as their genetic material. If they have RNA as their genetic material, they have to go backwards and make a piece of DNA. So a lot of these are considered to be retroviruses. But the DNA viruses can just make their proteins by copying a portion of their DNA. Not so with RNA. RNA has got to go backwards and make that piece of DNA. Also, viruses are going to enter one of two cycles. The first cycle is called the lytic cycle, and this is in your PowerPoint, so we'll be talking about it later. Excuse me. But if they enter the lytic cycle, what they do is they infect the cell, inject their DNA into the cell, shut your DNA down, and start replicating new viruses. At the end of the lytic cycle, it always ends in lysis, where the cell breaks open, all the new viruses are able to attack new cells. The second kind of virus is going to enter, these are called temperate viruses. They enter what's called the lysogenic cycle. In the lysogenic cycle, the virus is going to infect the cell, but instead of injecting its DNA and shutting our DNA down, it doesn't do that. It attaches to our DNA. So therefore, when your cell replicates itself, we also replicate the virus. Now, those types of viruses are going to be replicating themselves, and they can replicate for a long period of time. But then in order to make you sick, they will exit the lysogenic cycle, enter the lytic cycle, shut your DNA down, and obviously at this point we have many viruses in our system. So viruses that tend to lay low for periods of time, like herpes, hepatitis, those types of viruses, they enter the lysogenic cycle. They're in your system, they're replicating every time your cell replicates, and by the time they make you sick, you have got hundreds and millions of these viruses in your system. The other ones do not. The other ones are going to enter that lytic cycle. They're going to run their course. And typically we shed these viruses. We do have a means of shedding them from our system. But they can stay for a period of time, but they also can be expelled from our system. So given that about the two viruses, know that these viruses that we're going to go over on this sheet, these are all animal viruses. And so because they're all pathogenic, they're all going to be causing disease. There's not going to be any of these that are okay. So if you have one of these viruses, depending on your immune system, you may get a mild case of the virus. You may get a medium case or you can get a strong case. So that's going to depend on our immune system. And we will talk about things that you can do to increase your immune response to these viruses. All right, let's start with chickenpox and see if we can't get through it on this video. Chickenpox is airborne. So you're going to inhale it. Now, chickenpox is something that you probably have been vaccinated for. I'm sure that you have. My kids had it. I had it. They didn't have a vaccine for chickenpox when my kids were little or when I was small. Chickenpox, typically, you have spots. And in the middle of those spots, there's going to be blisters. Sometimes there's a mild fever. Sometimes the fever can be pretty high. But typically, chickenpox lasts about 2 weeks. And during that time, you have these individual red spots. Now, in the center, like I said, there's going to be a blister. That blister has a little fluid in it. That fluid, when it breaks open, is going to be spreading and making more spots. So that's the way that goes. This is a type of herpes virus. Now, another thing about viruses, because they're not alive, there's no scientific names, but they do have group names. There's coronaviruses like we're experiencing now. There's pox viruses. There's herpes viruses. And one would think that chickenpox would be a pox virus, but it really isn't. It falls into a herpes virus. Another name for chickenpox is herpes zoster. That is Zoster. And it is one of the viruses that follows the lysogenic cycle. Because what happens is this virus typically attaches to the nerve endings, and it can, in times of stress, when your immune system is compromised, it can come back. And typically when it comes back as the shingles. Now, you may know people have had the shingles. I've had the shingles. Maybe your grandparents have. This is not a fun thing to have by any means. But what happens with the shingles, you don't have the all over spots like you do with the true chickenpox, but you have bigger sores. And the sores are sort of itchy and painful at the same time because remember, this thing is on your nerve endings. The shingles typically are only on the trunk of your body. So they're going to go from your spine and they're going to go around your side to the front of your body to the midline, just right down the center. You usually don't have them on both sides, but you have them from the spine around to the front of your body, which we call the midline. And the sores can be very painful. They can be very distressing. If you've had parents that have had them, you probably know they're not any fun. And one of the things about shingles is typically when the shingles spots or the sores have gone away, the pain is still there because the virus is still on the nervous system. And so anything that's on the nerve endings can cause pain even if you don't see it. So sometimes people think, well, these sores have gone away, I should be okay. But they don't. They continue to have pain in those areas. I didn't have a bad case of the shingles. I did have the shingle vaccine, so probably I had a really mild case because of the vaccine, but typically this is one of those viruses that is laying low in your system and it comes back, but it does not come back in the same form that you originally had it. Now, since you guys have been vaccinated for it, you will not have to worry about the shingles, or I don't think you will. I'm definitely not a virologist, so I'm not certain about that, but you do not have the chickenpox, and therefore the shingles should not be coming back to you when your immune system gets low. At your age, it's when you're small, the chickenpox can be typically just one of those annoying things. You just treat the symptoms, you bring the fever down, you use some calamine lotion to keep the kids from scratching their spots because they're very itchy, and then they typically run their course, but in 2 weeks they're done. With older people, and you would be in that category as older, you don't deal with the chickenpox as easily and very often it can mean hospitalization. I have seen kids your age that have chickenpox everywhere in their eyes, their throat, their ear canal, everywhere. So they can be very problematic when you're older. But the good news for you is that you have been vaccinated. So the chickenpox is airborne, and even though you don't have upper respiratory symptoms, there's not really much you can do about it. The virus is in the air, and it's very common for kids to transmit this one from person to person because they're in each other's space all the time. Okay, I'm going to stop right there, and then we will start the second half.